Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing today? Thank you so much for being here today. Special thanks to the good people at Park Productions for capturing our guest speaker on audio video today so we can send it to the FBI. So, just kidding, Will, we know they're already in the audience. So, anyway, also thanks to Professor Todd Shack for bringing you all here, and for my students and also members of the public. Thank you so much for coming out to today's special event. I'm Mickey Huff, the Distinguished Director of the Park Center for Independent Media here at Ithaca College, and I'm also a Professor of Journalism in the Roy H. Park School for Communications, and I teach senior level courses on media literacy and independent media, as well as at Ithaca Seminar on an introduction to media literacy, which is a lot of fun. And I don't know if anybody knows here, but Chris Sperry is here actually from Project Look Sharp, so a really fantastic media literacy organization right here on campus with Cindy Shive. So if you're not familiar with Project Look Sharp, please do look into that. Last week we had the great pleasure of welcoming independent filmmaker Abby Martin to screen her film Earth's Greatest Enemy, so it was great to see folks come out for that. And this week I feel we're really blessed to have a double header, 2 weeks in a row. We have an absolutely amazing guest here, independent investigative reporter, really classic muckraking reporter is here, Will Potter, and I want to give Will a proper introduction to you. He's going to talk to you today about his new book, Little Red Barns, Hiding the Truth from Farm to Fable. That's right here, and he's got some copies here for anybody that wants to come up. I imagine Will's going to do a presentation for something-ish minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for conversation, Q&A, dialogue, that kind of thing. So that's what we're looking forward to. Will Potter is an award-winning investigative journalist and TED Senior Fellow who exposes political repression and the erosion of civil liberties. Timely subjects all. His reporting and commentary have appeared in the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and Rolling Stone, and has helped overturn prosecutions and challenge censorship laws. He has been invited to testify before the U.S. Congress, the Australian Parliament, and Council of Europe, advocating for protest rights and press freedom. And of course, one of my other hats that I wear is as director of the media watchdog Project Censored. It's our 50th anniversary next year, and our 50th anniversary book just came out right here. The main reason I mentioned that is Will Potter has graced the pages of Project Censored before with his previous work. So, his landmark book is Green is the New Red, which some of you may have heard of. It revealed how governments and corporations have labeled nonviolent activists as terrorists. Counterterrorism Unit surveillance documents described it as compelling and well-written. His new book, Little Red Barns, is the result of a 10-year investigation into factory farms and rising fascism, and was recently named one of Publishers Weekly's most anticipated releases and a starred review. Will's journalism and scholarship have been heavily influenced by growing up in the hardcore punk scene, and he has collaborated with bands including Rise Against, so horns for that. He also previously is a Knight Wallace Fellow and visiting professor at the University of Michigan, and was named the Distinguished Journalist in Residence at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. He was born and raised in Fort Worth, Texas. And it is my honor to welcome to you today the one and only Will Potter.
How are you all doing? I'm really grateful to be here. I've known Mickey a very long time through Project Censored, and then, like you said, appearing in the project, and it feels like a very appropriate place to be talking about attacks on press freedom. And I know you guys probably get the joke every time you have an event like this in Iger Hall, but it's still just a little it's a little on point. It was also great you guys had Abby out. I've worked with Abby a long time. What I'm going to do today is throw an enormous volume of material at you guys, hopefully in a conversational way. But this investigation started off with going into factory farms, but it spread to far-right groups, attacks on press freedom. And so we're going to try to stitch all these very diverse pieces together. And where all this started, this is frozen. Oh. There we go.
Nice.
So this is where we start. We all know what a farm looks like, right? This is obviously a farm. Who grew up with the storybook image, Old MacDonald, right? E-I-E-I-O. What sound does a cow make? Excellent work. I grew up in Texas, you know, pretty rural. I had family members who worked on factory farms. This is the story that we're born and raised with. It's the first story that we learned before God or money or Pledge of Allegiance or gender roles or anything like that. Before we can even speak or learn the alphabet, we learn about what a farm is. And I say this because after my first book came out, as Nikki mentioned, investigating how environmentalists were classified as eco-terrorists and the #1 domestic terrorism threat by the FBI, I was trying to sound alarm for so many years about the dangers of this. What happens if we start labeling nonviolent protest groups as terrorists, how it creeps to more and more types of people. And as Mickey said, I've testified before government bodies, I've been doing all this work. And then the book came out, this was 2011, and immediately that same year, there was a radical escalation of these tactics that, frankly, as a journalist, I felt quite naive that I wasn't anticipating. When I testified before Congress about some terrorism laws, I said, we need to be careful here because what you're doing could be used to go after journalists, to go after whistleblowers. And it got really heated. You know, I'm not probably going to be invited before Congress again, so that was my one shot, one and done. But they said, oh, you don't, this is scaremongering, nothing like that's ever going to happen. You need to take a logic course, Mr. Potter. And then, what do you know, that same year, we started seeing a series of laws around the country called ag-gag laws. Ag is for agriculture, and gag is to silence. And these laws were not about setting SUVs on fire, or breaking windows, or riots, or terrorism, or anything like that. They were about people that were taking photos of factory farms. Now, this lecture is not about factory farms, but as a little bit of background, since the 1950s, those little red barns of our imagination have been rapidly disappearing as they're replaced by a system that's industrialized. Some of these facilities that I've been on can have thousands or tens of thousands of animals. Some of these are called battery cages, where the birds are stacked on top of each other. Can have hundreds of thousands or even millions of birds. Just in the United States alone, there are 10 billion animals raised and killed for food every single year. And this is the dominant way of raising them. 99% of animals that are raised and killed for food, everywhere from Burger King to your local grocery store, everything in between. This is the system. And so it's significant that that system is increasingly out of public view. The investigations, first I'll say a little bit of background here. At this time, you know, it used to be doing undercover work was super expensive. The equipment was expensive, it was heavy, you know, not easily accessible. Even if you got good footage, you have to depend, as you guys know if you're in Mickey's classes, about how do we get this stuff actually on the news? You're dependent on the structures of media outlets, right? Think about what was happening in that time period though. You had the rise of social media, of YouTube, increasingly affordable recording devices, right, that we kind of all have. All of a sudden, this kind of very gatekeeping mentality of journalism was blown wide open. And you had these nonprofit groups that were, with very little money, able to go into these restrictive facilities, expose what was happening, distribute it in their own channels. You guys come on, don't worry about it. I appreciate it. Distribute it through their own channels, get millions of views, and then because of that attention, you had mainstream media outlets that were picking up the story. The stuff that they were exposing were egregious acts of cruelty like this, punching and kicking, sexually abusing animals, but also cows that were too sick to walk being pushed by heavy equipment. And this is significant because we're not supposed to have animals that are sick entering the food supply. So when those investigators exposed this, it led to the largest meat recall in US history because those sick animals would have been fed to kids as part of the National School Lunch Program. These investigations also exposed not just the really egregious behavior, but the standard industry practices. What is shockingly normal on all of these farms. And the industry kind of was flailing in response. They didn't know what to say, they were freaking out. Body slamming piglets to death, humane, pork experts say. This is how they deal with piglets that they don't have use for in the industry. The same with docking the tails off of pigs without anesthesia, cutting the beaks off of chickens. All of these things that are just the standard practice were all of a sudden in the public spotlight, and the industry was really freaking out. And now, when I mentioned testifying before Congress, the response was, Mr. Potter, this is never going to happen. It was me, the FBI, Homeland Security, and a series of corporate representatives. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's an extremist journalist, all this shit, right? Turns out, what do you know? The FBI was lying, as they lie repeatedly, and we got the receipts. And it shows that years before, they were already investigating nonviolent investigators as terrorists for doing things like videotaping the conditions of the animals. Beyond that, I worked with the former FBI agent to obtain these training documents of how FBI agents are trained in rooms like this one. This was a PowerPoint presentation. And in their slides about far-right groups, they're talking about militias and bombings and anthrax and murder. And their conversations about environmentalists and so-called eco-terrorists are what? Public relations war. The media is a vital part of every action, and God forbid that media is actually sometimes even in favor of the activists. This is the nature of the threat. You guys with me so far? This is a corporate created threat that we can have another lecture on from my other work of how this happened. But starting in the 1980s, corporations invented this term eco-terrorism. It became the #1 threat, and now you have the FBI going after activists for journalism. And it's just continued. I mean, obviously after the rise of Trump, these priorities haven't changed. They've just been institutionalized. This was an interesting case. Are you guys able to see some of the text? That the special agent from JTTF, which is the Joint Terrorism Task Force, was reassigned from going after far-right groups, white supremacists, fascists, to go after animal rights activists who had done things like put a video on the internet. So as a journalist, when I start seeing reporting and my craft being criminalized, it's kind of like with banned books, right? I don't know about you guys. You see a book being banned, it's kind of like, maybe that needs to be at the top of my stack of what I'm checking out. So when the industry is starting to criminalize news gathering, my, kind of defiant energy is to figure out another way of telling that story. So I went out and got some drones and started doing aerial investigations of factory farms, because it was this nebulous, like, it's not technically illegal, but you know what I mean? Like, we could kind of get around it. My other motivation in this project over this many years was, this story to me, it's not just about the animal cruelty, which is bad enough. It's about how it's affecting workers who often have to wear diapers because they're not allowed to have bathroom breaks. Highest rates of injury, overwhelmingly immigrants and not native English speakers. And what do you know? Black and brown folks are the ones working there, right? On top of that, this is an industry that is contributing more to climate change. Well, let me say this a different way. The research from Oxford and many others have shown repeatedly that even if we somehow get rid of the transportation sector, even if we somehow make all of these other changes that are most often in the news, we will not hit any of our climate goals to avoid kind of existential collapse of the environment unless we address food, and particularly factory farming. So from every angle, to me, this is one of the dominant stories of our time. We all have to eat. We all depend on this system, and meanwhile it's destroying human rights, the environment, attacking press freedom, and dangerous for animals. But the thing that happens with storytelling and doing an investigation is as soon as you start doing it, you realize what's out of the frame of the lens, right? I was doing these aerial investigations, which are cool, getting a lot of media, it's innovative and fun, all that stuff, right? As I was doing it though, at one point I lost a drone, because shit happens, I screwed up. Technical difficulties. Also, people were threatening to shoot them down, so it's like a very high-stress thing when you're trying to do this and not get in trouble. And through that, I lost the drone. I had to salvage the investigation, so I was connected with this woman, Helen, in Yakima Valley, Washington. And Helen had lived there for decades. She'd seen this transition from the Little Red Barn, which is why her and her husband moved out to the country, to the factory farms. And it had reached a point that they can't even open the windows. They can't breathe. as I met with her, and I talk about in the book in a chapter called The Poop Tour, which is what she took me on, she was sweeping up dead flies and spraying gas station perfume to try to mask the scent. And this is what it's like. You know, I've been on factory farms before. I've done this work for a very long time. I thought I was kind of seasoned in some way, right? I've never seen facilities like this. These are dairy operations, and kind of the way that it's displaying crops it a little bit. But this is all waste that was so bad it would overflow out of the farms. The post office at many points couldn't deliver mail because there's rivers of shit coming down the street. And shit isn't even really the best, I mean, it kind of is the best term because it's not feces, right? It's not manure. It's something else. Because on these factory farms, animals are pumped full of antibiotics and hormones. There's a mix of other debris and waste. And the way these factory farms work, you guys ready for the poop lecture? Okay. So obviously on the kind of red barns of our imagination, the animals walk the fields, the animals poop onto the ground, the poop goes into the earth, grows up the crops and vegetables and grass, and it's this like kind of miraculous, beautiful system, even when we're talking about shit, right? Factory farms, there's too many animals. There's nowhere for it to go. So it has to get pumped out. So from here, and I learned a lot about this. I went to the waste management trade shows, you know, went into the facilities myself. It's pumped into these, what they call lagoons. These lagoons can be the size of football fields. And what's interesting is, not interesting, but really dark, is that the government has a series of reports of how dangerous these are because those lagoons, they have to get agitated for the waste to get moved out, and they're all full of toxic fumes. So toxic that farmers repeatedly fall in, not from being drunk or whatever, fall in because they get overcome by those fumes. And the government warns about entire bloodlines of families and farmers being wiped out because the dad falls in, and then the grandpa goes and tries to get him, and then the son, and then the grandson, and the wife. You see where I'm going? Everybody ends up dying in a pit. That's how toxic these facilities are. And then all of that toxic sludge has to get piped out, so they spray it in sprinkler systems over the fields. And I was out there, and Helen was kind of teasing me. She's trouble. Like she was, you know, she got her start, she was documenting a lot of this stuff with disposable cameras and getting into it with farmers, being chased away with bats and shotguns and stuff. So we went out together, and you know, I tend to kind of push the limits sometimes of investigations. And she was getting a little fired up. And she was telling me stories about this, and then also at the same time, warning and being very just concerned. She's like, I'm worried about you going home to DC. You're gonna get sick. And I'm like, I've done this before, I'm gonna be okay. She's like, you don't understand. People come out here and then they go home and they're sick for weeks. And that's exactly what happened. I grew up with asthma and COPD. It's pretty managed now, but I was okay for the most part, and then I could feel my lungs just like, you know that feeling where you just kind of cave in and it shuts down? It's like when you push, you're doing Murph or you're doing laps or whatever, and it's just like you can't get air anymore. Went home and had to get on steroids, and anyway, that's another story. But the point is, I know, shout at me if I'm going way too fast or dumping too much on you guys. That little red barn, because it's that first story we ever learn, all the industry has to do, because as you all know, we have a confirmation bias as human beings, right? We want to believe what we think we already know. And if we're primed to believe that this is a farm, all the industry has to do is use that imagery and rhetoric of that little red barn, and we're kind of pulled into it. And if you want a fun little game, go to the grocery store, go to the co-op. It doesn't matter what type, Whole Foods or Safeway or Kroger, it doesn't matter. It's all the same narrative. And I thought, you know, at the time I was living on a farm in rural Michigan, commuting back and forth, teaching at the University of Michigan, and building a new journalism program, building a storytelling program. I was teaching people about narrative psychology, about how storytelling influences our lives. And then going back and forth on motorcycle, buzzing past these little red barns for several years, missing the story that was right in front of me. And I say that because that's how powerful these images are. It keeps them in this kind of like trance state. So when I saw that, the investigation shifted. And you're starting to see why this was a 10-year project. I thought I saw it, lost the drone, realized, well, I don't really have the story, lost the story again, saw the little red barns, and started going deep into not just the history of the red barns, but things like Old MacDonald. And just to geek out for a little bit, I went down the kind of obsessive rabbit hole of procrastination and research. The earliest versions of Old MacDonald, E-I-E-I-O, right, everybody knows it. It's just about the sound that animals make. It was very, very different. It's about defying all care and strife in a charming country life. The old versions of the song and their different versions over the years were about community. They're about what it felt like to live in a rural environment, right? It's a very different story. And over the years, that story shifted. Now at Old MacDonald, it's all over the world. The Little Red Barn is all over the world. It's translated into dozens and dozens of languages. And it's all about just the noises that the animals make. So to me, this felt like it was on to something. This is what's keeping us in the dark, as we've gone from a connection to our community, a connection to farming, to now, this was at, where was this? Vancouver Island in Canada. The grocery stores are called Red Barn Markets, right? And even better, Fair Oaks Farm has a little Marriott right on site. This place is called the Disneyland of agricultural tourism, right? Who's been to the, petting zoos? You take the school field, we all did this stuff, right? The industry is tapping into that familiarity we have with the Red Barn, and they're ramping it up. So you go and stay in the Red Barn Hotel. You go and you get a sanitized tour of a farm that has been exposed literally just like all the other ones. Kids go on ropes courses and bouncy houses because that's obviously super educational, right? And we're just trapped in this story. So I felt like that, okay, I got a grasp on this. Storytelling is keeping us in the dark. Storytelling is censorship. And then January 6th happened, and it just kind of broke my brain a little bit. Because I've spent literally my entire life since I was a teenager, my first newspaper jobs, covering political repression and attacks on protest movements and journalism. So then this happens, and you have far-right groups, and if you don't know, some of the folks that were in the Capitol Rotunda were very well-known white nationalists and white supremacists. I'm not saying everybody at January 6th was that extreme. I don't think that's true at all. I think a lot of folks were kind of misguided, others had good intentions, whatever you want to think about it. But a lot of those folks, kind of the ringleaders, from the Proud Boys to Oath Keepers, 3%ers, avowed Aryan Brotherhood people, folks like that, were out front. And I started getting into some pretty heated discussions with my colleagues that were covering this, because the narrative from the FBI was, well, our hands are tied. We need more power. We need new terrorism laws to go after the far right, because we can't investigate stuff like this as domestic terrorism. It doesn't qualify. And the reason it was breaking my brain, I was just like, they've done this. They've lied for decades. They've lied for decades. In fact, the FBI was told repeatedly by the Inspector General, by congressional reports, and by others, that if they kept focusing on environmentalists and animal rights activists investigating farms, that it would allow for the rise of far-right violence and people are going to die. Like, this is what the report said flat out, and the FBI said, we're not changing course. And then this happens, and I don't know if you all remember it all, but the FBI was asking for the public's help, asking people to submit photos to help them identify. So I took another motorcycle trip. up north in Michigan. I was just like, I need to get the hell out of this. Like, I can't. How did this entire social movement disappear? How did this repression disappear? And what shifted my thinking on the way home was seeing all the little red barns, but they had Blue Lives Matter flags. They had Trump, Make America Great Again. And the reason this is significant is because historically, fascists and authoritarians from the Third Reich, Mussolini, Franco, I would argue today, in Philippines, Erdogan, Hungary, they depend on mythological narratives, right? Everything about fascism is a promise to the public that things are scary right now, but we're going to take you back to a time when it was safer, where we understood what a man was and a woman was, and traditional family values, and lift yourself up by your bootstraps, right? There's so much baked into Make America Great Again, right? It's a rejection of modernity, but it's also this myth that never existed. And I would argue that the Little Red Barn is that myth for us. I mean, you have Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene and others that are doing press conferences in front of Little Red Barns because it makes us feel, I would argue, both safe and it's coded as reflecting traditional values. You guys still with me on this? Okay, I know we're going on. Great. So I was like, okay, this is a great theoretical explanation. But then, again, to be a journalist, you have to be obsessive and you have to just keep testing your ideas. So I went back to the archives and I was like, maybe this is just a good story I'm telling myself. Some of the things I found were Ezra Taft Benson, who's really attributed like being the guy that pushed for the industrialization of agriculture. He's often quoted as saying, get big or get out. I don't think he actually ever said that to farmers, but that was the Bible. It was, you have to industrialize or you're gonna lose your farm. Starting in the 1940s and 50s, going all the way up to today. Turns out he was a rabid white nationalist, anti-communist. He collaborated with the FBI to go after protest groups over the decades. The history of the Border Patrol, the guy who is recognized as kind of being the precursor or the founder of it, was a Texan who was advocating the buildup of this force specifically to round up and kill Mexicans. And he said it was needed because they're coming across the border, and Native American folks also, are stealing cattle. So this language of like protecting the farm, protecting the homeland is so baked into our entire history that it started kind of breaking my brain again. This was the Porvenir massacre in Texas, where an entire village was murdered. And then they argued it was necessary to protect cattle ranchers. And then from there, he went up to DC, started the Border Patrol, and what do you know? We got ICE now. I mean, to me, this is all a very clear line from these massacres to where we are today. But it gets even more difficult to believe. The top company that created the technology to track prisoners and migrants then went from, quote, I don't know if you can see it, it's a Boulder company. It went from cows to cons, was the quote of the executive. Because they realized, hey, there's money in industrial agriculture. There's also a lot of money in fascism and authoritarianism and racism that we can capitalize right now. And there's a lot more we can talk about this. It's hard for me to not geek out too much because once you start going down this path, like the way that prisons are painted to keep prisoners calm started from that research on how to keep animals calm as we send them to the kill floor of the slaughterhouse. These systems are so intertwined, not just in our history, but in how fascist groups today talk about this stuff. You know, obviously on January 6th, you have this like use of animal imagery. This goes back to the KKK. The KKK wasn't always white hoods. Their first costumes were horns. They would impale runaway slaves with horns because it was part of this like embracing the animal to be wild and to be unhinged, right? to be violent. When they went into violent mode, they shifted into this to go track black folks. Not only that, you have white supremacists will do rallies where they chug raw milk. Anybody want to take a guess about why they do that, what the significance is? This has been a trope. Yeah, go for it.
Don't they like hate pasteurization?
So this is part of it, this is adjacent to it, but it's even longer, this goes back before pasteurization too. That, and I found records going to the early 1900s, that milk was a sign of racial superiority because black folks and Asian folks have higher rates of lactose intolerance. So if you could chug milk, that means you're part of the master race, right? How disgusting is that? So there's just like these, I can't help just see these like clownish little boys chugging milk like they're going to daycare or something. But we've seen this, so the pasteurization point, the raw egg, this whole like make America healthy again, natural thing. The guy that was on the Tucker Carlson show, Mr. Raw Egg Nationalist, his publisher publishes straight up, avowedly, openly Nazi propaganda. There is a fitness manual from the Third Reich that they republish. Like, if you want to get fit, train like the Nazis did so you can go kill some Jews. Like, it is that bad. And this is now being mainstreamed into food rhetoric because it's, like you said, I mean, there's this interest in healthy and natural. Richard Spencer is a little irrelevant now after he got knocked the fuck out and humiliated at a protest. But you can see I'm very tolerant, lactose tolerant. Like, it's all these dog whistles. The same as using the OK sign, right? All these different things where they're like, we don't know why liberals are and the left are calling us fascists, as we're doing things to show to our people how fascist and authoritarian we are. Okay, I know I'm dropping a lot on you guys, but the significance of this, regardless of how you feel about farms or any of these other things, I would argue what I've documented across my kind of life at this point, of the attacks on protest and how that's shifted, this is the playbook. This is the post 9/11 definitive playbook of how you criminalize protest and social movements in communities. And I've traveled a lot globally for talks and research and stuff. When I was in Austria, I met with lawyers who told me that the FBI has traveled to brief Austrian law enforcement. The FBI is a domestic agency. To brief Austrian law enforcement about how to prosecute animal activists as terrorists in other countries. Now Europol lists undercover investigations as a terrorism threat. These ag laws, I was down in Australia for a month, they've been copied and pasted and passed into law in Australia. Canada, they've been passed into law. And in my work, I talk a lot about the idea of political repression and state repression, right? These are kind of some overused terms that talk about when state power goes too far and you start trying to silence protest. I would argue we're entering in this like hybrid world of its state repression, like protest movements have always been attacked, but it's really also corporate driven. And those two are merging together. So like with these ICE raids and contracts right now, these private detention centers are money-making operations for industry, right? The technology, all of it, people are trying to cash in. And that's why they're going to the White House and being like, okay, we're gonna look the other way on your white supremacy and all the things you're doing because we're gonna cash in. But the point about this is that if we realize it and see it that way, corporations have no national boundaries. That's neoliberalism. They go wherever the money is. And when they cross borders, they can take these tactics with them. And so my warning that I try to make in my work is that no matter how you feel about all of these social issues, this puts absolutely everybody at risk. This is creeping from these environmental and animal rights activists. It's the same things we're seeing in Cop City protests in Atlanta. We can talk about that. These RICO cases. When I was on Democracy Now! A couple weeks ago talking about the designation of anti-fascist as a domestic terrorism organization. Did you guys see this? We have crossed so many thresholds And I say this, and this is not to scare folks, but it's to have an honest conversation. For 25 years, I've been trying to say, hey, we better watch out. Hey, we better watch out. Trying to sound the alarm. Now the Trump administration is explicitly trying to round up not the sabotage, the saboteurs, not the radicals. They're listing everyone who is against them as anti-fascist. In that national security memo, they're talking about going after funding, going after nonprofits. When I was in the Bay 2 weeks ago, I had people for the Center for Biological Diversity, a very mainstream environmental group, come up and saying they're now being investigated as anti-fascist. And it's worth noting also, like this whole being anti-fascist, you see how that's coded, right? Like, I don't know, this is a journalism and English majors, I'm sure, but like, the double negatives cancel each other out. So to be so explicitly anti-fascist is, they're being very clear about their intentions. I mean, how are we on time, Vicky?
You're good.
Good?
We have until 11:15. It's now 10:40, so
Sweet.
you have a good half hour.
Is it all right if I read a little bit?
Sure.
This is just to kind of wrap things up. Now, here's the thing. I know with a lecture like this, and I feel like I'm that guy, this is why I get, or I don't get invited to parties, right? In the publishing industry, we call this a beach read. You know, you got like 50 Shades of Grey, some books on factory farms and fascism. Like, I understand how dark all this shit is. And the book, to me, is not just this investigation of these issues. It became really kind of my struggles with what that means. As a journalist, I grew up with the idea of, and also spent my childhood in the Catholic Church. Split ways with the church pretty early, but stuck with journalism. And in both of them, there's this idea of bearing witness. Right? Have you guys heard this term?
Yeah.
And I've put a lot of faith in it. Like, in fact, covering secret prisons and human rights abuses and all this stuff around the world, I think I've put an unreasonable faith in it. That I don't know what to do, none of us know what to do, but as journalists, we bear witness. We go where other people can't. We will put our bodies on the line with the faith, and it is an act of faith, that other people will see that too, right? We go into war zones to document the genocide in Gaza. Well, I mean, we know why all the journalists are being exterminated there, more than any other conflict in world history. But they're being exterminated, truly, because they're bearing witness. Because if they document, I think power structures know that other people will see it, and despite our doom scrolling and our overwhelm, it does affect us, and we do want to do something about it, right? This shifted all that for me. I mean, both with like January 6th, I'm like, well, okay, we're not seeing this. We're not seeing Helen, we're not seeing the animals, we're not seeing these social movements, we're not seeing the political repression. Like, what do we do now as journalists? Like, this has been and the story is about me, but I just want to be transparent here, that like, it becomes your identity as an investigative journalist, right? This is, I don't do other things. Like, I have motorcycles and journal, like, you know what I mean? You build up this identity of like this faith. And now to see the rise of authoritarianism in such over-the-top terms, so blatant, so explicit, and to feel like so many of us are just choosing not to see it, has been a real struggle. I'm sure a lot of folks are struggling with that as well. At the end of the book, I return to this idea of bearing witness, though. I have not given up the faith. One thing I realized in the course of writing this is that term, bearing witness, it's often used to describe just the act of sight, as if like, you know, just scrolling and seeing the thing is the witnessing. But historically, bearing witness has always meant two things. It is to see, and then to testify about what you see. And that testimony is both our journalism, protest, speaking out, community gatherings, whatever. So I want to read this, just a page or two, about that idea of bearing witness. Let this be my testimony then. We have within us the ability to see it all. We can see the animals, the workers, and the Helens. We can see the environmental crisis and the fascist threat. We can see the stories hiding it all. We can also see more, let our view widen beyond the story of this farm. We can see the genocide abroad, the poverty at home. We can see our neighbors, and we can see ourselves. Bearing witness to it all together doesn't make any one of these sights less egregious. It doesn't make me less of an animal advocate to see the farm workers. And it doesn't make human rights concerns less valid by acknowledging animal suffering. Instead, by seeing the stories that connect these victims, we begin to see something else entirely. Not a collection of siloed, fragmented causes, but a conjoined, interconnected, monstrous mess. I warn you that this approach to social issues comes with a cost. Bearing witness to the full scale of this crisis, including how we are personally implicated, is frustrating and exhausting, to put it mildly. But the more I open myself to truly witness, the more nuanced my thinking becomes, the more maddeningly complex and interconnected. Although I've maintained my values, I've moved further away from puritanical solutions or holier-than-thou rhetoric. I'm increasingly able to see my own behaviors and judgment through the eyes of the witness. Media scholar Sue Tate called this the, quote, embodied knowledge of suffering, the limit experience that defies representation. Bearing witness is more than observing injustice, it's allowing that trauma to shape you and guide your response. This is a practice that's available to all of us. You don't have to be an undercover investigator or a crisis journalist. We can embrace it in our daily lives as a way of living and navigating this world. To witness is to put yourself on the front lines, physically at times, but also emotionally. To embody witnessing is to embody empathy. The more I've allowed myself to see, the more humble and connected to others I feel. Bearing witness means to face the onslaught of this world, all of its darkness and evils, and do so with not just our eyes open, but also our full hearts, so that we hold space for that suffering and allow it to change us. The fear people have, I think, is that bearing witness to suffering means that your life is going to be suffering. I'm convinced the opposite is true. By bearing witness, our view of the entire world changes both shadow and light. I've now spent most of my life bearing witness to humanity at its worst, and in doing so, I've placed myself in positions where I've also been able to witness humanity at its best. Even in the most bleak stories of injustice and loss, I have seen bone-chilling heroism, empathy, and grace. By bearing witness, we take in shared pain and trauma, but through that act, somehow, miraculously, more space opens up within us, and it is love, rage, and courage that flows into it. As a journalist, this is the fate that I found in witnessing, that we're all strong enough to look, that to bear witness, even when you might be attacked or imprisoned, is an act of spiritual defiance, that if we speak about what we have seen, others will see it too, and through our collective action, our shared testimony, we will write a new story together. So in that spirit, I'm really grateful for you all bringing me out here and having this conversation. I look forward to questions and comments and talking about it.
We have a good 20, 25 minutes remaining, so please feel free to participate and ask questions. And Bill, you know how to run the classroom, so have at it.
I'll stand here awkwardly as we figure out our, oh, already got one. Okay, let's go.
Yeah. When you see this tremendous air pollution like you described out in the farm in Washington, where they're spraying manure through the air, and this happens in chicken farms in the Carolinas and throughout, then certainly people must bring that to attention to people that are invested in that stuff. Government agencies are in charge. What happens? How does it get snuffed? They just walk away from it?
That's a great, I'm really glad you brought that up, because it's kind of an oversight to not mention that in the talk. A few things are happening. I think the best way to understand it is, remember, like with big oil, big tobacco, for years they found ways of convincing us that actually that's not happening, and cigarettes might be good for you, right? I would argue the industry now, the ag industry, is using similar tactics. So for instance, in many states and at the federal level, they've passed laws restricting open records laws and release of information because they argue, hey, if we put this information to the public, extremists might use it. So they're shutting down the basic data of what's happening. They're passing new laws like this to make it illegal to document further. I went to international climate meetings where in those reports, the industry's lobbying and money power is being used to strip mentions of animal agriculture from the climate reports. Especially the heavy meat producing countries like Brazil, Argentina, the US, and others are directly sitting down and saying, we're not going to sign off on any of this climate stuff unless you remove any mention of animal ag. There's all this research about environmental benefits of a plant-based diet. All of that's being stripped out. So the long way of answering this is that it's a mix of direct censorship, restricting access to public records and public information, rewriting the laws, and frankly, I would argue a bit of gaslighting in the sense of telling people what we're seeing is not actually what we're seeing. The environmental heavy chapters of this book were the hardest to write, not because of muckraking journalism, is because there's too much information. Like, this is too well documented. I'm drowning in one report after another, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, MIT, like peer-reviewed research that this industry is decimating. It's leading to extinction loss, loss of biodiversity, the eutrophication of water, algae blooms. I mean, it's grim. It is grim. And the industry is using these clean meat campaigns. There's actually Tyson, I believe, just the other day, was it yesterday? I've been on the road. But there have been lawsuits about this, that the industry is trying to rebrand their factory farm produced products as green and environmentally sustainable, right? Because we all want that. It's like, oh, go green. Sure, I'll buy this, whatever, that we don't know anything about it. There's no enforcement mechanisms. So this is an industry that really operates without any oversight or accountability.
So, Will, before I pass this around, can you tell people just briefly
Oh,
what
yeah.
this is, and then I'll pass it around, and if anybody
I
wants
appreciate
to
that.
sign up, they certainly can, but they don't have to.
That's a great idea. So, carrying forward that conversation about witnessing and kind of rethinking what journalism in this era means, I'm starting a new project. We're starting a new media platform. It's called How to Live in a World on Fire. We are going to be talking both about how you navigate political and personal crises, how we move through this moment together, both in terms of mental health and navigating really dark times, but also organizing and taking action. If anybody's interested in being involved in that project, we're still kind of in the early stages, probably launching early in the new year. You can reach out to Mickey and others and get connected. And this email list is just getting updates on that if you're interested. It's going to be a YouTube show and podcast, and we've got some other kind of live event stuff planned. I think that's going to be fun. That's part of it is, my thinking is changing a little bit. I'm still a journalist, I'm still doing this work, but I'm thinking a lot more about how we make sense of this moment, rather than just trying to expose the bad news there.
Ryan, did you have your hand up? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this is kind of like an impossible question, I know, but like you're talking about, mass industrialized factory farming. Do you think there's like, a way forward to counteract just the scale of what's going on? And do you touch on that in your book?
You mean going forward in terms of food systems? And
Yeah, like improving or dismantling, this huge global system.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the heart of this. It is a tough question. I try to approach it from a couple different perspectives. One, I think there is this, even from like the far right crowd, this interest and passion in this question. I think people are resonating with this idea of wanting to be local and smaller and sustainable, and that's being co-opted and manipulated. So I think part of it is trying to not have those kind of holier-than-thou rhetoric. And I'm vegan, I've been vegan since I was a teenager. I'm not trying to make like a push to veganism necessarily. Like that's great if y'all want to do that or go vegetarian, but I think we need everybody in this discussion. So that's kind of where I start, of no matter where you are personally and what change you want to make in your life, like we all have a vested interest in this conversation. It's complicated though, because there's a lot of research coming out that like buying local actually doesn't have the environmental impact that we think. It's a lot more important what we consume and where it's produced, which is kind of counterintuitive in some ways. I think we need a little bit of everything. I mean, frankly, that's how I'm trying to move through the world right now with issues this big and this complicated. It's like, all right, you want to go back vegan or vegetarian, or you want to advocate for that? We need that. You want to advocate for small farms and sustainable farms, and maybe you come from a family of farmers that want to change how you're doing things? We need that. You want to talk about these kind of venture capital tech startups that are making like lab-grown meat? It kind of freaks me out in a dystopian sense, but like we probably need that too to sustain life on this planet. Like that's how bad this is. We, I think, have to not rule out necessarily any of those. And I know that doesn't give you all clear guidance on how to move forward, but it's because I kind of feel like I lack that clear guidance too. I think the best thing we can do is a mix of, how do I say? I think there's a tendency when we talk about this stuff to really put it on ourselves, to really make this so personal about like, what do I do? What do I purchase? And that's a huge part of it, but we also need to look at these systems and how they work. Because like, that's what big oil did. They invented this idea of our carbon footprint to make you think about how much gas you're spending and how many showers you're taking, rather than what these global multi-billion-dollar industries are doing to destroy the planet. So I think we need that in the conversation too, of, yeah, make personal changes, absolutely, but also keep your sights on the people that are destroying the planet.
To kind of like go off of something that you had just said about going and buying more locally, I want to know your thoughts about the word sustainability. What do you feel is that? Because I feel like that contains a lot of images of greenwashing and things like that. So do you get that in your book too?
100%. In all of these terms, there's no enforcement mechanism. There's no teeth behind it. So everything from sustainable, humane, pasture-raised, even free-range, all these things, they're just jargon. I mean, there's not teeth behind it. To me, sustainability, I go back to kind of the 7 generations approach, right, that we learned from First Nations and indigenous folks, of like something sustainable if it can sustain 7 generations down the road. The way it's used by industry is just that like it's a modicum better than the shit you're being fed. So I think we have got to be really careful. Greenwashing, as the climate crisis intensifies, I think it's become a lot more dominant. I will say, related to that, another thing I didn't bring up was, it's not just those terms, but even our laws don't have enforcement mechanisms. Everybody knows the Animal Welfare Act, right? You've heard about this? How many people know that Animal Welfare Act defines animals as not including animals raised on farms or used for research? I'll say that again. The text of the Animal Welfare Act, from its inception, has been to define animals as excluding the most animals that are raised for any purpose in the world, and just for food. Agriculture is one of the largest land use systems on the planet. 1/4 of all the land on the planet is for agriculture. Most of that agriculture is feeding farm animals. The Animal Welfare Act says by law what happens to them can't be considered cruelty because they're not considered animals. State laws, there's about 25 to 27 states that have exemptions for what are customary practices. The industry defines what are customary practices. So if the industry says, hey, it's standard operation for us to body slam piglets to death, or in the chicken industry, egg industry, male chicks have no value, so they're literally ground up alive. They're just put in these trash cans and either suffocated or ground up. And you have 25 states that say, well, that can't be considered a violation of animal welfare laws because we've defined it as a standard practice. So not to go off on a tangent there, but like, we need to be so critical. It's both media literacy, consumer literacy. These terms are being used to weaponize and deceive us.
Well, I just wanted to interject super
Yeah.
fast, not to take too much time, but we lived in, before we moved here, we were in California for a long, long time. We lived in Petaluma, which was a big agricultural center in Sonoma County. And just recently, a young activist there was found guilty of rescuing 4 chickens.
Yep.
Right? I just wondered if you could maybe talk about that and connect it to the 19-year-old law, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act.
That's a great
Which
point.
we've written about, because this is a, to your point in your talk, this is a long-standing practice, and after 9/11, they threw anything they could at going after, very specifically, climate activists, animal rights activists. And the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act is so draconian that if you're found guilty of interfering with any business that uses animal products, you can somehow be nebulously tracked, sort of drag-netted in this kind of definition. And this person in particular, I don't know if you know her or not, but she was just found guilty. Yeah, if you could just tell us a little bit maybe about that. I don't know if folks are familiar with that, but this is something that just happened this past week in Northern California.
That's exactly it. So a couple pieces to this. I'll say real quick, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act is that law that I testified against. It's written so that anything that causes a loss of profits to an animal enterprise. Animal enterprise is defined so broadly that it can be really anything. I mean, Walmart's an animal enterprise because they sell leather footballs.
Yes.
Right. That's how broad it is. Causing a loss of profits is defined as terrorism under the law. There's no exemptions for protest activity. One of the Democratic co-sponsors stood up on the House floor and said that, yeah, it could be used against civil disobedience. On top of that, when it passed, and this is what my writing about this was in one of the Project Censored anthologies, there's 5 members of Congress in the room.
Yes.
It was snuck through, everybody else was out honoring Dr. Martin Luther King with a new monument in Washington, D.C. You guys get the juxtaposition here? Praising Dr. King, raising trouble, breaking the law, sit-ins, disobedience. Oh, you do a sit-in? You do civil disobedience? That's terrorism if you cause corporations to lose money. So that all set the stage for now, recently, this one young woman, she's a student at UC Berkeley, y'all's age, I mean, could be anyone in this room. She went out with a group, she wasn't like Black Mask doing covert stuff. They showed their faces, they investigated a farm, they saw how sick and diseased the animals were. She rescued several birds. That's it. That's it. Those are the predicate acts of the case. Those are her accusations. And they're not accusations because she did it, and she said she did it. And she was just convicted. I was out there, I've seen her a number of times, and the law school that I'm affiliated with, we represent her, so I'm very familiar with the case. But she's facing 5 years. And we can have a whole separate conversation about those 5 years aren't going to be the same as other prisoners' 5 years. Because when you get that terrorism designation, it reclassifies you in the prison system. So I've met with folks who were, quote, red carded, meaning they, in prison, in a medium or even in a max, you don't want to stand out, right? Because people suspect you're a pedophile, you're a snitch. It's very, very dangerous to stand out. And the government is red carding prisoners, meaning they make them wear a red card where they have to check in every, I forgot what the interval is, with one of the guards. So everything about it, from the moment this rhetoric is deployed, it can get you sentenced to prison on charges that would not have been possible otherwise. It can send you to exorbitant prison sentences. I've talked about activists who have got 20 years for damaging SUVs. On top of that, it reclassifies you in the prison. And even if you're in like so-called gen pop, or like a regular prison, Other prisoners have been sent to communications management units, which are secretive prisons that were opened, I would argue, illegally, that I've been to, that are for prisoners classified as security risks and domestic terrorists. They're not even able to hug their family or write. Their letters are tightly monitored. Visits and phone calls are restricted. So this is an entire, I guess the point I want to hit home with that is Zoe's case, Zoe Rosenberg in California, is really reflective of this entire system of power that's been institutionalized post 9/11. What started as a fringe campaign is now business as usual.
Thank you so much for all your work. I can't help but see the parallel with Gaza and Rwanda, but for example, how I would say like all the conflict recently, I would say was triggered by the assassination of Shireen Abu Akleh, the journalist, and since then we've seen so many journalists in Gaza being killed. But one thing that I've just recently learned is that Israel, the IDF was putting these M113, they're like expired war equipment, and they would load them up with explosives in neighborhoods in Gaza, and they would do up to like 10 of these a day, and they would just blow up. And so the resistance, they're like just young kids go in and they're like with pliers try to break, try to cut these robots up. And so this is the resistance. These people that are going in and trying to like, cut out bombs in their neighborhoods. So like, and the people that are covering these stories are considered Hamas. They're considered terrorists just by telling these people's stories. So what do you see? Because like right now, people just taking pictures of a cow being pushed that's considered terrorism in this country. So like, how do you see the resistance in this country, like resisting this storytelling?
I appreciate that. A couple things immediately come to mind. One is I think that's an appropriate comparison of that disparity of power, right? And I think it is important to see that because it reflects the nature of this term terrorism, that it is always used against people that lack power, that in whatever form, we think of it as a plain hijackings and hostages. No, it could be stealing some chickens, clipping some wires to try to protect your community. Anything that's moving upwards against people in power can be labeled as terrorism, but no matter how violent the state is, of killing journalists, bombing hospitals, having the bodies of children shown with bullet holes in their heads targeted. It doesn't matter how extreme, that can't be called terrorism. So I think that's part of it to understand. The other thing that comes to mind thinking about Gaza in particular, is I remember, it was really stunning to me wrapping up this book and seeing IDF and government officials talk about Palestinians as animals. We saw that in the States, right? Remember, they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats. The Trump brothers calling Black Lives Matter protesters animals. And to me, as someone who cares about animals and has investigated this, and also a scholar of fascism, sends all the red alarms up in the air. Because when we start talking about humans as animals, that means the worst abuses of power and violence are about to happen. Because that's what we do to animals. You're an animal, it doesn't matter. We could, ground you up alive and whatever, all the horrible things. You're labeled as an animal, as a Palestinian child. We can do whatever the hell we want because you're not human. So in terms of the resistance to it, it's tough to answer because it shows both how that system is designed to do this. It is, the history of the United States has been one, we're taught about MLK, we're taught about Malcolm, we're taught about American Indian Movement, all these people we look up to as heroes. They were all treated, if not as terrorists, but as enemies of the state. So I think we have to incorporate that in how we think about resistance, particularly to combat the fear that this creates. personally speaking, I've dealt with that fear by recognizing how systemic this is, of like, this is the pattern always. So when I had visits with the FBI, and I've got counterterrorism unit files, I kind of tricked myself in some ways into thinking, well, okay, that's the side of this equation that I want to be on. I know that's not the healthiest thing, but I think we have to do it as part of building a resistance of recognizing. You know, I think it's easy to think in protest movements, we have this really sanitized mythology that people speak truth to power and fight the good fight, and then society changes. And what actually happens, it's a very small group of people that kind of get their asses kicked a good deal at the time, make some incremental change, time passes, and then we look back and say they're heroes and we put them in history books. And so for what it's worth, I'm trying to view all of this now in that historical context. And I guess I would say that to you all as students. To try to remember this moment that we're in, others will come looking for answers. Others will come looking for answers of what you did right now, what you did with your life, what mattered to you, why you didn't fight back, why we didn't speak up more about Gaza. And I think if we see ourselves as bearing witness for history or to history, it really can open up and I think be free in how we think about resistance.
We have 5 minutes left, and I know Phil's in the front, and we have two more students that wanted to ask, so if we could get, yeah.
Sure, we'll get through it.
Probably go with the student.
I appreciate that, sure.
My question was, growing up, like that sort of local food, being really invested into farming thing, that to me was always like a hippie thing. And I've seen it sort of transition towards like that healthy living, natural living becoming more of a right-wing thing. And I was just wondering if you, like, what you know about that, what you could tell me about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. One of the groups I talk about in the book, it hasn't always been that. It was hippie, but it's also been connected to other social movements. There's a group in Philly called MOVE, which is like a black liberation organization, that they were combining thinking about this kind of hippie issues, caring about animals with like liberatory politics. And so people have been making these connections, and I think this shift to the far right embracing it, frankly, feels really disingenuous to me. Like, I think they're using it to try to tap into cultural change. You know, RFK is talking about food dyes and whatever, but they're paying lip service to those issues, but they're very far removed from those kind of hippie values.
Wasn't Move bombed?
MOVE was literally
Yeah.
the Philadelphia Police Department from a helicopter dropped a bomb on the MOVE compound,
Yeah.
killing the activists and children, setting them on fire. The mayor of Philadelphia a couple of years ago finally apologized, but it was really the most egregious act of repression in U.S. history. And I would argue part of it is because MOVE was connecting these dots. Yeah.
Part of neoliberalism, as you were saying earlier, is just getting rid of like as many regulations as possible. And we can, I mean, it's pretty obvious in like agriculture. I was wondering like what you think is going to happen in like other industries. Like in the future, we already got like rid of a lot of like water regulations, air, and stuff like that.
I think that's the threat. I mean, and that's why I think this is the playbook. Because think about it, what industry doesn't want to not have to follow open records laws, to not report to the public, to not allow journalism and photography? This is the neoliberal playbook. And so I think they see in these campaigns, and I've already seen it spread from animal ag to other industries are using similar tactics. So I think this is going to be, we're going to see more of that, particularly as public opposition grows. That tendency is going to be to clamp down on information more to manage their power.
We have time for one more.
Sure.
How does a 10-year-long investigation work from like a financial standpoint when you don't really have something to do?
That is a great question. It works. That was not my exclusive work. I was a visiting professor at Michigan. I started and stopped this project repeatedly. I almost turned it into an ebook. I'm quite open in the book. It coincided with a very long period of suicidal depression and PTSD. So there's a lot of reasons this kept going. Sustaining myself, I've approached it, coming out of the punk scene and hardcore scene. The mentality growing up in that world was if you want to tour the world, you want to be in a band, you just go do it. This DIY ethic. Like you don't wait for permission, and you don't even wait for like all the pieces to fall in a row for funding and whatever. You just go hustle. And I've really approached my work that way. I had some freelance stuff along the way where I kind of chunked this investigation into different things that paid. Sometimes I get speaking gigs that pay. I was teaching. At one point in this, I talk about in the book, I was delivering sandwiches for a deli. So full disclosure, I know I get to come in and I got the great CV and it sounds like I've got everything together. Sometimes you just got to figure out how to make it work. And I think that's something to leave you all with, especially in this room, of like, it's easy to see talks like this, or my buddy Abby who was here, who was just kicking butt. But we both, like, so many times, it's just like, all right, I don't know how I'm gonna make this work. Like, I don't know where that next paycheck is coming from. I mean, that's not where I'm at now, but y'all are gonna feel that at different points. And I think there's always this temptation to feel like there's a safer path, right? I don't think there is. And I think that's what I wanna remind you all. You feel like, oh, I can't follow my passion or what I really would want to do because I need X, Y, or Z. Even if you get that corporate job and you got the 401k and whatever health benefits they still give us, they don't care about you. Like, your job isn't going to be guaranteed. So for what it's worth, I think there's a lot more power of just saying from the start, like, I'm going to figure out how to make this work. If you want to tell stories and do investigations and make media or film or whatever, just start doing it. Surround yourself with people that care about similar things, and eventually you'll see yourselves, kind of like me and Abby, you'll get older, you're still doing the cool shit, and you can help each other out, and pieces start falling into place. So don't give up. I always told my journalism students, you have to do the work that's going to burn you up inside if you don't. And if you're sitting here and you're just like, oh, you know, that's cool and everything, I don't have an interest in whatever, it might not be for you. Because this is like kind of a difficult environment to be a journalist right now. But if this is the kind of work that will burn you up inside to not do, and I think a lot of you are probably in that camp, you just have to move in that direction. And the more that you're authentic and kind of focused on what you really need to do, I do believe, maybe I'm getting a little woo-woo in my old age, but like, I do, it's not manifesting, we're not gonna go to that shit, but it's more of the like, you just work hard enough and you're true enough to yourself, pieces do fall into place, and then you're a professor and books start coming out and it's like, oh, actually I'm figuring out how to do this.
Thanks so much, Will. for
My
taking
pleasure,
time.
thank you.
While we are officially out of time, no one's beating the door down from the outside yet. So if you want to hang out and talk to Will, we can stay here for a little while. And I just want to remind you all that this is exactly the kind of journalism that the Park Center for Independent Media supports. Please check us out if you want to learn more. We also support internships, hint, hint, with organizations and people doing new projects. So maybe that's you. Maybe some of the stuff that you've heard this week, last week with some of the events, and I want to thank Professor Shack for merging classes again. So if you want to learn more about the center and what we're doing or figure out how to be more involved, please come see me at Park 257. Thanks so much for being here today. I really appreciate it.